When the inheritance was read aloud, my family went completely silent. The conference room smelled like old leather and my father's cologne, which made no sense because he'd been dead for 3 weeks. Mr. Jeffrey Brennan, the estate attorney my father had trusted for 32 years, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat for the 3rd time. My mother sat to my left, her black dress perfectly pressed, her hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a portrait. My sister Olivia fidgeted with her wedding ring across the table, and my brother Nathan stared at the polished mahogany like he could see through it. When Jeffrey started reading the actual distribution section, his voice changed. It got quieter. Careful. My mother's breathing stopped completely. That's when I knew something was catastrophically wrong. I'd been my father's right hand at Callaway Industries for 8 years when the heart attack took him on a Thursday morning in March. No warning, no decline, just gone between his first and second cup of coffee. I was the one who found him slumped over his desk, his hand still holding a pen, a half-written email to a supplier frozen on his screen. I was the one who called 911, performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, rode in the ambulance holding his hand, even though I knew he was already gone. The funeral had been massive, standing room only, a testament to the empire he'd built from a single hardware store into a chain of 38 locations across 4 states. I'd delivered the eulogy. Olivia had cried through hers. Nathan hadn't been able to finish his. My mother had stood silent and elegant, accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute. Through it all, I'd assumed the business would continue as it always had, with me stepping fully into the CEO role I'd been training for since I was 23 years old. That assumption died in that conference room. Jeffrey read the preliminaries first, the standard language about sound mind and body, the date the will was executed, the witnesses who'd signed. My father had updated it 6 months ago, which I knew because I'd driven him to Jeffrey's office myself. He'd seemed distracted that day, had asked me to wait in the car instead of coming in with him like I usually did. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now that memory felt like a shard of glass working its way toward my heart. Jeffrey's voice droned through the charitable donations, $100,000 to the Children's Hospital, $50,000 to the animal shelter my mother volunteered at, $25,000 to his college alma mater. Standard stuff. Expected. Then he reached the section about the business, and his eyes flicked up to meet mine for just a second. That's when my stomach dropped. To my son, Nathan Callaway, I leave controlling interest in Callaway Industries, consisting of 65% of all shares, along with the position of Chief Executive Officer and all associated powers and responsibilities. The words hit like a physical blow. Nathan's head snapped up, his face a mask of shock that looked almost genuine. Almost. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My mother remained perfectly still, but I saw her fingers tighten in her lap, knuckles going white against the black fabric of her dress. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. Nathan, who'd spent the last decade bouncing between startups and get-rich-quick schemes, who'd borrowed money from the family business 3 times and paid it back exactly never, who showed up to company events drunk and hit on the employees. Nathan, who'd told me at Dad's funeral that he was finally free, now that the old man couldn't lecture him anymore. That Nathan was getting everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed relationships and weekends and sleep to achieve. Jeffrey continued reading. To my daughter, Olivia Callaway Sterling, I leave the family home in Riverside, the vacation property in Aspen, and a trust fund of $2 million to be distributed in annual installments of $100,000 over 20 years. Olivia started crying, but they weren't sad tears. They were tears of relief. Then Jeffrey reached my section, and his voice got even quieter, like he was ashamed to read the words. To my son, Daniel Callaway, I leave my personal effects, my book collection, and a one-time payment of $50,000, with the stipulation that he sign a non-compete agreement preventing him from working in the retail hardware industry for a period of 5 years. The room spun. $50,000. After 8 years of 70-hour weeks, of missing my own life to build his company, of turning down job offers that would have paid me 3 times what he did because I believed in family legacy, in loyalty, in the promise that someday this would all be mine. $50,000 and a legal document that would prevent me from using any of the expertise I'd gained. I looked at Nathan, really looked at him, and saw something flicker across his face that made my blood run cold. It wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction, quickly hidden but unmistakable. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known this was coming. I'd been sitting at my father's right hand at every board meeting for 5 years, presenting quarterly reports, negotiating supplier contracts, implementing the inventory management system that saved the company $300,000 annually. I'd been the one to suggest expanding into commercial construction supplies, a move that increased revenue by 40% in 2 years. I'd been the one working until midnight and coming in on Sundays, the one who could recite profit margins and inventory numbers from memory, the one everyone called when there was a crisis because they knew I'd fix it. Nathan worked in business development, which meant he played golf with potential investors and occasionally showed up to ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I told myself it didn't matter, that Dad was grooming me for leadership while giving Nathan busy work to keep him involved. I told myself that when the time came, everyone would see who'd actually earned the succession. I'd been telling myself a fairy tale while my brother had apparently been writing a different ending behind my back. Jeffrey finished reading and set the document down with a heavy sigh that told me he'd known this would explode. My mother spoke first, her voice steady and cold as January rain. Well, that's settled then. Nathan, we'll need to meet with the transition team tomorrow to begin the handover process. Daniel, I assume you'll be professional about this. I'm sorry. I know this must be difficult. Just an assumption that I'd roll over and accept the betrayal without protest. I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I intended. When did he change it? The will. When exactly did Dad decide to cut me out? Jeffrey's jaw tightened. The current version was executed on September 19th of last year. But there were drafts, discussions. The final decision took several months. September. 6 months before he died. 6 months where he'd looked me in the eye every single day, had accepted my work, my dedication, my belief that I was building towards something. 6 months where I was already written out, already discarded, and everyone in this room except me had apparently known it. I stood up so fast my chair skidded backward. This is insane. Nathan doesn't know anything about running the business. He can't even balance his personal checkbook. Nathan's face flushed red, his satisfaction morphing into defensiveness. Dad obviously thought I was ready. Maybe he saw something in me you couldn't. The words were practiced, rehearsed, like he'd been preparing for this confrontation. Or maybe someone convinced him you were ready, I said, looking at my mother. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just met my eyes with an expression I couldn't read. Your father made his own decisions, Daniel. If you're suggesting I influenced him, you're mistaken. But she didn't say no. She didn't deny it. She just deflected with the kind of careful language she'd always used when she was lying. I'd heard it my whole life. The way she'd told my teachers I was sick when she'd forgotten to drive me to school. The way she'd told my father she'd paid the bills when the money had gone to her shopping trips instead. She was good at it. Had probably been practicing since before I was born. Jeffrey cleared his throat again, pulling a manila envelope from his briefcase. Daniel, there's something else. Your father left you a letter. He specified it should be given to you privately, but given the circumstances, I thought you might want it now. He slid the envelope across the table. My name was written on it in my father's handwriting, sharp and angular, the same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards and my college recommendation letters and the Employee of the Year certificate he'd presented to me 3 years ago. My hands shook as I picked it up, and I hated that everyone could see them shaking, hated the vulnerability of it. I'll read it at home, I said, standing. I need to leave before I say something I'll regret. Olivia reached for my arm as I passed. Danny, wait. We can talk about this. Maybe there's a way to work together. Maybe Dad wanted us to figure out a partnership or I pulled away from her touch. Did you know? When you hugged me at the funeral and told me everything would be okay, did you already know I'd been written out? Her silence was answer enough. I drove home on autopilot, my mind a hurricane of memories and rage and questions that multiplied faster than I could organize them. My apartment felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in, the air too thick to breathe. I'd bought this place 2 years ago, had chosen it because it was close to the office, because I'd planned to spend most of my time there anyway. I'd furnished it minimally, had never gotten around to decorating because I was always working, always proving myself worthy of the legacy I'd thought was mine. What a joke. What a stupid, pathetic joke I'd been. I opened the letter standing in my kitchen, my hands still shaking, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The paper was thick, expensive, the same stationery my father had used for important correspondence. His handwriting filled 2 pages, and I recognized the pen, the heavy fountain pen he'd used to sign contracts, the one I'd given him for his 60th birthday. Daniel, it began. No dear or son, just my name like a summons. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've just learned that I've left the business to Nathan. I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed. You have every right to those feelings, but I need you to understand why I made this choice, even if you can never forgive me for it. The words blurred, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. You are the better businessman. You're smarter than Nathan, harder working, more dedicated. You have the vision and the drive to take Callaway Industries to heights I never dreamed of. That's precisely why I couldn't leave it to you. Your mother and Nathan need the business in ways you don't. Nathan has no other skills, no other prospects. Without this company, he'll fail at everything he touches. Your mother, for all her faults, has been planning this for years. She's manipulated, schemed, and positioned Nathan as my successor because she knows that when the business fails, and it will fail without you, she and Nathan will still have assets to liquidate, will still be able to walk away with something. My breath caught in my chest, the words punching through the anger to something deeper and darker. He'd known. He'd known the business would fail, and he'd given it to them anyway. I've set up a separate account for you, Daniel. Jeffrey Brennan has the details, but you'll need to request them specifically. It's not in the will because I didn't want your mother to know about it. The account contains $3 million, the true inheritance I'm leaving you. Use it to start fresh, to build something of your own, something they can't touch or corrupt or destroy. You have the talent to create something better than I ever did. Don't waste it trying to save a family that doesn't deserve you. The letter continued, but I had to stop, had to set it down because my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. $3 million. Hidden from my mother, from Nathan, from everyone. An inheritance that actually meant something, that would let me start over, build my own empire, prove that I was everything my father believed I was. But why hide it? Why the elaborate deception, the public humiliation, the $50,000 slap in the face? I forced myself to keep reading. I know this will hurt. I know you'll feel abandoned and betrayed, and I'm sorry for that. But your mother has been planning to contest the will if I left everything to you. She has documentation, fabricated evidence that you've been embezzling from the company. It's all lies, but she's been careful, working with Nathan to create a paper trail that would take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to disprove. If I left you the business, she'd drag you through courts and destroy your reputation before you ever got to run it. This way, she gets what she thinks she wants, and you get to walk away clean with the resources to start fresh. The room tilted sideways. Embezzlement. Fabricated evidence. My own mother had been setting me up, building a case to destroy me if my father did the right thing. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined, darker than I'd thought possible. The letter ended with one final paragraph. I failed you as a father by allowing this situation to develop, by not standing up to your mother years ago when I should have. I've chosen the coward's way out, giving them what they want so you can be free. I hope someday you'll understand that I did this because I love you too much to watch them destroy you. Build something amazing, Daniel. Show them what real success looks like. And when the business fails, and it will, don't try to save it. Let it burn. They've earned that fate. You've earned better. I love you, and I'm proud of you. I always have been. Dad. I read the letter 3 times, then called Jeffrey Brennan's personal cell. He answered on the second ring, his voice careful. Daniel, I was expecting your call. The account, the $3 million, he said you have the details. Jeffrey's sigh carried the weight of secrets kept too long. Your father established it 2 years ago, kept it completely separate from the estate. It's in a trust with your name, but there are conditions. You can't access it until the will has been processed and finalized, which takes about 6 months. He wanted to make sure your mother couldn't challenge it or find out about it until the estate was closed. If you try to access it early or tell anyone about it, the trust stipulates the money gets donated to charity. He was very specific about that. You have to let the next 6 months play out exactly as they appear to be going. 6 months. 6 months of watching Nathan destroy everything I'd built, of pretending to be bitter and broke, of letting my family think they'd won while I waited for the real inheritance to unlock. The next morning, I went into the office for what I knew would be one of the last times. Nathan was already in my father's office, sitting in the chair I'd thought would be mine, looking through files with the kind of desperate concentration that comes from being in way over your head. I knocked on the doorframe, and he jumped like I'd caught him stealing, which, in a way, I had. We need to talk about the transition, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I'm sure you want everything documented so there are no misunderstandings. Nathan relaxed slightly, leaning back in the chair like he owned it. Which, legally, he did. Look, Danny, I know this is weird, but Dad made his choice. I need you to accept that. I stepped into the office, closing the door behind me. I'm not here to fight with you, Nathan. I'm here to tell you that I'm done. I'll train whoever you hire to replace me, but I'm giving my notice. 2 weeks, and I'm out. His face cycled through relief and panic. 2 weeks? That's not enough time. I need you to stay on, at least for a few months while I get up to speed. That's not my problem anymore, I said, and felt a dark satisfaction at watching him realize I meant it. You wanted the business? You've got it. Figure it out. I spent the next 2 weeks documenting every system, every supplier relationship, every process I'd developed. Not for Nathan, but for the employees who'd been loyal to the company, who didn't deserve to suffer for my family's dysfunction. I met with department heads, explained I was leaving, watched them process the reality that Nathan would be running things. Most of them scheduled their own exit meetings within days. By the end of my second week, 8 of our 20 key employees had given notice. Nathan panicked, called an emergency meeting, tried to convince people to stay with promises he had no authority to make and bonuses the company couldn't afford. I watched it all with the detached interest of someone observing a car crash in slow motion, horrible but impossible to look away from. My mother called me on a Friday evening, 4 weeks after the will had been read. Daniel, we need to discuss your behavior. No greeting, no small talk, just the accusation. What behavior would that be? I asked, pouring myself a drink and settling into my couch. You've been poisoning people against Nathan. Half the staff has quit, and the ones who remain say you told them the company was doomed. Technically not true, but I hadn't exactly discouraged the conclusion. I documented systems and explained I was leaving. What they chose to do with that information is their own business. Her voice hardened. You're hurting the family, Daniel. Your father wouldn't want this. The hypocrisy was stunning. My father set me up to fail and left me almost nothing. I'm not sure he gets a vote in what I do next. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something almost conciliatory. I know you're hurt, but there's still a place for you here. Come back. Help Nathan learn the business, and we can revisit the compensation package. Maybe a vice president position, a proper salary. So you can document more embezzlement evidence? The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. Dad's letter mentioned some interesting things. Did you really think I'd just accept being cut out without questions? Another long pause. When she spoke, the pretense of motherly concern had evaporated. That letter is meaningless. It's not a legal document. It's the confused ramblings of a dying man who was on too much medication. He wasn't on medication when he wrote it. He was perfectly healthy, and Jeffrey Brennan witnessed it, so I'd be careful about calling it meaningless. I heard her breathing, fast and shallow, the sound of someone calculating their next move. What do you want, Daniel? There it was, the real question, stripped of all pretense. What would it cost to buy my silence, my cooperation, my complicity in whatever scheme she'd orchestrated? I want you to leave me alone, I said quietly. I want to forget I ever had a family. I want to build something new somewhere far away from all of you. That's what I want. She laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You'll be back. You'll fail at whatever pathetic attempt you make, and you'll come back begging for a position at the company. They always do. She hung up before I could respond, which was probably for the best, because I didn't have a response that wasn't some variation of violence. I blocked her number, then blocked Nathan's and Olivia's for good measure. If they needed to reach me, they could go through lawyers. I was done pretending we were a family. 3 months into my exile, I was working as a consultant for a small commercial real estate firm, using the $50,000 from my father's will to pay rent and buy time while I figured out my next move. It was boring work, well beneath my capabilities, but it kept me busy and paid the bills. I'd started sketching out plans for my own business, something in supply chain logistics, using all the relationships I'd built over the years, but focusing on a different industry to avoid the non-compete. I was having coffee one morning when my phone rang from an unknown number. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Daniel Calloway? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. Yes, who's this? My name is Alan Foster. I'm a detective with the Commercial Crimes Division. I'd like to ask you some questions about Calloway Industries. Can we meet? My stomach dropped. This was it. The embezzlement accusations my mother had prepared, coming home to roost, just like my father had warned. Am I being accused of something? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Not at this time, Foster said carefully. But we're investigating some irregularities in the company's finances, and your name has come up in the documentation. I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Would you be available this afternoon? I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my apartment, spent the next 3 hours imagining scenarios and preparing defenses. Jeffrey Brennan had told me the trust was protected, that my father had insulated it from any challenges, but legal protection meant nothing if I was sitting in jail on fraud charges. I showed up 30 minutes early, claimed a table in the back corner with a view of the entrance, and tried not to look as nervous as I felt. Detective Alan Foster turned out to be a compact man in his early 50s with a military haircut and the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd heard every lie in the book. He bought a coffee, sat across from me, and pulled out a tablet and a leather-bound notebook. Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Calloway. I want to be upfront. You're not under investigation. At least not for anything you did. But I need your help understanding some financial transactions that occurred during your tenure at Calloway Industries. I felt something uncoil in my chest, the first breath of relief in weeks. What kind of transactions? Foster tapped his tablet, pulling up a spreadsheet. In the past 18 months, approximately $800,000 has been systematically transferred out of Calloway Industries accounts into various personal accounts. The transfers were made using your administrative access codes, but the destination accounts don't belong to you. They belong to Nathan Calloway and your mother, Patricia Calloway. Were you aware of these transfers? The world shifted into sharp focus. $800,000, transferred using my credentials. The embezzlement evidence my mother had been building wasn't just fabricated, it was real, except she was the one stealing, framing me in the process. I had no knowledge of any unauthorized transfers, I said carefully, but I can explain how she might have gotten my access codes. I spent the next hour walking Foster through the company's administrative systems, explaining how my mother had served as the company's bookkeeper for years before they hired a proper accounting firm, how she'd had administrator-level access that my father never revoked, how she could have easily copied my credentials or used her own access to make transfers appear to come from me. Foster took notes, asked pointed questions, and by the end of the conversation, I could see the investigation taking shape in his mind. One more question, Foster said as we were wrapping up. Your father's will. You received a much smaller inheritance than your siblings, correct? I nodded, wondering where this was going. And you left the company very shortly after his death, despite being in line for leadership. Why? I considered lying, considered deflecting, but something about Foster's direct approach made me want to match it. My father left me a letter explaining that my mother and Nathan had been planning to frame me for embezzlement if he left me the business. He chose to give them what they wanted so I could walk away clean. I thought he was being paranoid. Apparently, he was just being accurate. Foster's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a kind of grim satisfaction that suggested he'd just had a theory confirmed. Would you be willing to testify to that? And do you still have the letter? I had the letter memorized, had read it so many times the paper was starting to wear thin at the folds. Yes to both questions, but I need to know. What happens next? Next, Foster said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. I get a warrant for the company's complete financial records, interview your mother and brother, and build a case. If what you're telling me is accurate, and preliminary evidence suggests it is, they're looking at multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. Your mother could face 15 to 20 years, Nathan probably less, depending on his level of involvement. The numbers felt unreal, too large to process. My mother, who'd raised me, who'd taught me to tie my shoes and read bedtime stories, facing decades in prison. Nathan, my brother, who I'd protected from bullies in elementary school, looking at federal charges. I should have felt something, sadness or regret or horror at the dissolution of my family. Instead, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Olivia. I'd unblocked her number after the meeting with Foster, figuring she might try to reach out as things started to fall apart. Danny, we need to talk. It's about Mom and Nathan. Her voice was tight, strained, the sound of someone barely holding panic at bay. What about them? I asked, though I already knew. The police came to the office yesterday. They took boxes of files, interviewed half the staff, questioned Nathan for 3 hours. Mom's lawyer told her not to say anything without legal counsel. Danny, what's going on? I let the silence stretch, let her sit with the uncertainty and fear. They're being investigated for embezzlement and fraud. Apparently, they've been stealing from the company and using my credentials to do it. The police think it might be connected to why I left. Olivia's breath caught. That's insane. Mom wouldn't do that. She wouldn't steal from her own husband's company. Wouldn't she? I asked quietly. Did you know about the financial irregularities? When you accepted your $2 million trust fund, did you wonder where that money came from? How the company could afford such generous bequests while I got nothing? She was crying now, soft broken sounds that might have moved me once, but now just felt like background noise. I didn't know, Danny. I swear I didn't know anything. Maybe that was true. Olivia had always been the sheltered one, the baby of the family who believed the best of everyone. Or maybe she'd been willfully blind, taking the money and refusing to ask questions because she didn't want to know the answers. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. The police will probably want to talk to you, I said. My advice is to be honest about what you knew and when. If you're not involved, cooperating is your best chance of staying uninvolved. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I didn't call back. The investigation took 4 months, a slow-motion unraveling of my family's carefully constructed lies. Foster kept me updated, filling in details as they emerged. My mother had been siphoning money from the company for years, small amounts at first, then increasingly bold as she realized no one was checking her work. She'd accelerated the theft after my father's first health scare 2 years ago, knowing she was running out of time. Nathan had been complicit but not the mastermind, following her instructions without really understanding the scope of what they were doing. The plan had been to transfer as much as possible before anyone noticed, then blame me using the access code evidence she'd carefully cultivated. When my father died and left Nathan the business, she'd thought they were safe, that I'd simply leave and never look back at the financial records closely enough to notice the discrepancies. She hadn't counted on a routine audit by the new accounting firm Nathan hired, or the firm's decision to report suspicious activity to law enforcement. The day of the arrests, I was at my small office when Jeffrey Brennan called. It's done. They arrested Patricia and Nathan this morning. Bail hearing is this afternoon, but given the amount involved and the risk of flight, I'd be surprised if they're granted bail. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to feel something appropriate to the moment. Victory, relief, sorrow, all I felt was tired. Jeffrey, when can I access the trust? Your father's estate closed last week. The trust is available as of today. I can have the paperwork ready for you to sign tomorrow if you'd like. $3 million, sitting in an account with my name, ready to fund whatever future I wanted to build. My father had been right about everything. Nathan's incompetence, my mother's manipulation, the company's inevitable failure without me there to save it. He'd even been right about the embezzlement accusations. The only thing he'd been wrong about was thinking I'd build something amazing immediately. I'd needed these months of exile to shed the old skin, to stop being Richard Calloway's son and become just Daniel, a man with no legacy to uphold or family to please. The trial was a media spectacle, the kind of family drama newspapers loved. Hardware heiress accused of $1 million fraud. Mother and son embezzlement ring exposed. Family business betrayal leads to federal charges. I attended the first day, sat in the back of the courtroom and watched my mother and Nathan in their expensive suits, flanked by lawyers they could barely afford now that all their assets had been frozen. My mother saw me, our eyes meeting across the courtroom, and for a second I saw something in her face that might have been regret, or might have been rage. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Louise Whitmore, 15 years in the Commercial Crimes Division, with a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. She laid out the case with brutal efficiency: the timeline of transfers, the falsified records, the digital trail that proved my mother had used my credentials while I was documented as being in meetings or out of town. She presented my father's letter, authenticated by Jeffrey Brennan and 3 handwriting experts. She called Detective Foster, who testified about his investigation and the mountain of evidence they'd compiled. The defense tried to argue that I was the real thief, that I'd framed my mother and brother out of spite over my inheritance. But they couldn't explain the pattern of transfers that continued after I'd left the company, couldn't explain why I'd voluntarily walked away from a business I was supposedly stealing from, couldn't explain the letter or my father's elaborate plan to protect me. Their case fell apart over 3 days of cross-examination, each answer making them look more desperate and dishonest. Nathan cracked first, admitting on the stand that my mother had directed the transfers, that he'd known they were stealing but told himself it was family money anyway, so it didn't count as theft. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts for my mother, guilty on the major charges for Nathan, though they showed him some mercy on the minor counts. Sentencing would come later, but the prosecutor was asking for the maximum: 18 years for my mother, 12 for Nathan. I didn't attend sentencing. I was in Portland by then, signing a lease on a warehouse space that would become the headquarters of Callaway Logistics, a supply chain consulting firm that specialized in efficient inventory management for mid-sized retailers. I'd used $500,000 from the trust as seed money, had recruited 3 of the best employees from my father's company, people who'd left when Nathan took over and who jumped at the chance to build something new. I'd spent months developing the business plan, refining the pitch, preparing for every possible challenge. Within 6 months, we had 12 clients. Within a year, we'd expanded into 3 states. Within 2 years, we were profitable and growing faster than I'd dared to hope. I'd built something of my own, something that bore my name, but reflected my values, my vision, my work. My father had been right. Freed from the weight of his legacy, I'd created something better than he ever had. Olivia reached out periodically, emails mostly, updating me on family news I didn't ask for and didn't want. Mom was in a federal facility in Ohio, had made friends with the other white-collar criminals, was teaching a financial literacy class that the irony of was apparently lost on her. Nathan was at a minimum security prison in Pennsylvania, would be eligible for parole in 8 years if he kept his nose clean. The company had been sold to a competitor for cents on the dollar, the Callaway name now just a subsidiary brand of someone else's empire. Olivia had moved to California with her husband, was working as a real estate agent, was trying to start over somewhere no one knew the family story. She always signed her emails Love Live and never acknowledged that I never wrote back. 5 years after my father's death, Jeffrey Brennan called to tell me the trust was fully distributed, the last of the paperwork finalized. Your father would be proud of you, Daniel. You've built exactly what he hoped you would. I was standing in my office, looking out at the warehouse floor where 30 employees were processing orders, solving problems, building the kind of efficient operation I'd always dreamed of creating. He wouldn't have had to be proud if he'd just been honest from the start, I said, but there was no heat in it anymore, just statement of fact. Maybe, Jeffrey allowed, but he did the best he could with the situation he had. Not every father would have had the foresight to protect his son the way he protected you. That was probably true. My father had sacrificed his reputation, had let me think he'd betrayed me, had orchestrated an elaborate deception to keep me safe from my mother's schemes. It was the kind of love that hurt, that left scars, that I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive even though I understood it now. Last month, I got a letter from my mother. Handwritten on prison stationery, 6 pages of justifications and excuses and requests that I understand she'd only done what she thought was necessary to protect Nathan. She didn't apologize, not exactly, just explained that I'd always been so capable, so self-sufficient, that I didn't need the inheritance the way Nathan did. She asked if I'd consider writing a letter to the parole board in 9 years when she'd be eligible, asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive her, even if I couldn't forget. She signed it, "Love always, Mom," like nothing had changed, like we were still a family, like she hadn't tried to destroy my life to cover her own crimes. I read the letter once, then fed it through the office shredder. Some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness and some families aren't worth saving. I'd built a new life, surrounded myself with people I'd chosen rather than people I was obligated to, created something meaningful out of the ashes of my father's empire. That was enough. That was everything. When the inheritance was read aloud, my family went completely silent. But that silence wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the only one that mattered. The story I wrote for myself, without their permission, without their blessing, without them at all. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.